Thank you. Okay, Natasha, I'm going to cue you as soon as we're ready, okay? Stand by. It's about a little less than a minute.
Natasha, it's great to have you doing this. Terrific. Thank you.
She's a rock star for doing this. Okay.
Greetings, everyone, and welcome to this call. Thank you so much for joining us. My name is Nakaja Bethune, and I will be moderating the call. But first and foremost, a little bit about me is that I'm a DC native. I'm a local student. I'm an organizer, an activist, and a new member of the Green Party. This call is about centering our public policies on people instead of private profit and special interests. You will hear from some great local issue leaders and candidates on a range of public policies. And the first topic we're going to be discussing tonight is housing. DC is one of the wealthiest cities in the nation, yet has the highest intensity of gentrification. Not enough is being done to create and preserve affordable housing, strengthen rent control, or invest in public housing. And too often, the council has put profits ahead of people, lining the pockets of politically connected developers instead of acting in the best interest of residents. Our first speaker, Will Merrifield, spent 8 years as an attorney at the Washington Legal Clinic for the Homeless, where he represented tenant associations and defended people against eviction. He believes our leaders should use public money and public power for the public good, and that's why he's running for DC Council at large. Welcome to the call, Will.
Hey, thanks for having me. I appreciate it. Yeah, so I mean, like you said, my name's Will Merrifield. I'm an independent running for DC Council at large. I have been a housing attorney representing tenant associations across the District of Columbia for the last 8 years. And I represented these tenant associations going through large scale redevelopment projects. And, you know, I fought on the front lines with tenants trying to keep their housing affordable through those redevelopment projects and trying to prevent people from being displaced. And unfortunately, what I've seen in doing that work is that all too often, our local elected leaders are working directly with politically connected developers and actually giving these developers hundreds of millions of dollars of taxpayer money and public land to build luxury units that working class people can't afford. Like you said, it's causing mass displacement. It is driving up rents for everybody. And we're dealing with this horrific family homelessness crisis on the back end of things. I just want to illustrate one project to sort of get people's minds around what I'm talking about, because I don't think that, you know, most Washingtonians know to the extent to which this, you know, luxury market, this affordable housing crisis that we find ourselves in is actually funded through our taxpayer dollars. So let me walk you through one project. I'm the tenant attorney. I've been the tenant attorney for a place called Brooklyn Manor for the last, I don't know, 6 years. And at Brooklyn Manor is 535 units of deeply affordable housing. It's in Northeast DC, right up the street from the Rhode Island Avenue Metro, right up the street from the Rhode Island Avenue Metro. So at Brooklyn Manor, a developer put together a redevelopment plan to demolish all 535 units of deeply affordable housing that's there. And not only is this housing deeply affordable, it has large bedrooms. It's one of the last places in Washington, D.C. that has large bedrooms. So this developer puts forth this plan to demolish all 535 units. And in the place of those 535 deeply affordable units, the developer proposed to build 1,750 new units. So the developer wants to triple the amount of housing that exists there now. But in tripling the amount of housing, the developer proposed to eliminate a vast amount of affordable housing and also eliminate all 5 bedrooms and all 4 bedrooms, and originally a significant amount of 3 bedrooms. So this plan had the potential and has the potential, I believe, to displace thousands of people from that area. Now, we as the Tenants Association, as the attorney for the Tenants Association, I've been doing this a long time. So you expect to fight tooth and nail against developers when they're putting forward these redevelopment projects, and you use every tool in your toolbox: litigation, the media, organizing on the ground to prevent, these projects from displacing people. But in the case of Brooklyn Manor, what should, it may be shocking to people, but it shouldn't be if you follow how politics works in DC, is the DC Council, every single member of the DC Council voted to give that developer at Brooklyn Manor $47 million of public money to go through with this redevelopment project that has the potential to displace these families at Brooklyn Manor. So that is the way politics works in DC. And Brooklyn Manor is just one example. Our public housing is, our local government has not invested in making repairs to public housing in DC. The federal government has starved public housing of resources, and now it's crumbling around its residents, and our local politicians are cynically using that as an excuse to privatize and sell off that public housing. So this is the state of affairs we find ourselves in Washington, D.C. I am running a campaign, in direct opposition to this type of politics. So, I think the thing that I'm proud about with the campaign that we're running is not only do we have a critique of the current system, which I just talked about, the hyper commodification of housing, using public money to stoke this affordable housing crisis by putting money in the pockets of developers to build this unaffordable housing, we are actually also proposing a solution to this crisis. And the solution that I'm proposing is social housing. And what social housing is it's a way to build mixed income, deeply affordable, non-means tested housing that actually pays for itself. The way you do that is governments look at housing as they should, as an infrastructure project. The government builds housing on a mass scale. People are allowed to move into that housing, paying 30% of their income in rent. The higher rent earners subsidize the lower rent earners. And because we've eliminated the profit motive, 100% of rent is used productively and reinvested back into the building, reinvested back into your community to cover the operating costs of the building. Now, at the end of the month, once all the rents have been used to cover those operating costs, there's money left over. And that money, that would have been a big profit for a developer. But since we've eliminated developers from this process, that profit becomes what's called a surplus for the building. And that surplus is actually used to pay off the construction loans for the building. So like I said, social housing is a way to build deeply affordable mixed income housing that pays for itself. And the key to doing this is eliminating the profit motive. And the benefits of social housing are not only that it gets underneath the problem, the commodification of housing, but it also is a way to provide a lot of other benefits to the local economy. If we looked at social housing as its infrastructure project, post-pandemic, we could create essentially a New Deal project to put people back to work, building the thousands of units of social housing necessary to solve the affordable housing crisis, get money in people's pockets, and have that money recycled back into the local economy to jumpstart us post-pandemic. We would also, by relieving people of the severe rent burden they have, people have more money in their pockets. If people have more money in their pockets, they spend that money in the local economy at small businesses, again, which will be essential to jumpstart things, jumpstart the economy post-pandemic. People would be able to save money. They would be able to buy homes because people just wouldn't live rent poor and rent burdened as they do now in the District of Columbia. And then lastly, the ground floor retail in a social housing project, in a social housing world, that ground floor retail would be much more affordable to small businesses than the ground floor retail is at, you know, these existing luxury apartments. We see many of our small businesses, specifically minority-owned small businesses, are priced out of the district just as tenants are priced out of the district. So in a social housing model, these small businesses would be paying a fraction of the rent that they pay now, but that fraction of rent would still go a long way to cover operating costs and eventually paying off the construction loans for the building. So that's what our campaign, one of the aspects of our campaign is this notion of using public money for the public good by investing in a New Deal program for Washington, D.C. to build social housing, put underemployed and unemployed people back to work doing it.
Thank you, Will. And how can residents get involved in this campaign? How can they make sure that they're being active on this housing issue in DC?
Yeah, I mean, you know, our website is fordc.com, will4dc.com. If you go there, you can read much more about social housing. You know, we're coming up on Election Day, November 3rd. I know people are already early voting. I've been out knocking, you know, on doors and calling people all day, trying to talk to as many people as I can. So, you know, if you believe in social housing, I would ask for your vote. On November 3rd, you get 2 votes for the at-large candidates. There's 25 people on the ballot, I believe. So there's a lot of people on the ballot. You get 2 votes. I am last on the ballot. So if you're voting in person, you have to scroll through some computer screens to find me. On the paper ballot, I'm really easy to find because my name is the last one of all those at-large candidates. And past that, you know, I would just encourage people, get involved in community organizations. You know, One DC is an organization that does great work. Empower DC is an organization that does great work around affordable housing, around, you know, public housing and fighting for, you know, public housing not to be privatized. So, you know, I think getting involved in organizations, existing organizations in DC that are working on these issues is vital. As a housing attorney, we ran a ton of our organizing through One DC. And, you know, for Brooklyn Manor, for Congress Heights, which are, you know, projects that people may have heard of that, you know, big housing struggles in DC. So I think joining local organizations is essential.
Thank you for that. And I'm encouraging all our participants to please ask questions. If you have any, you can drop them in the chat or in the Q&A. Let's just be as engaged as possible because this is not only for us, but for you guys, for the community. So let's be as engaged as possible. Our next topic is public banking, an idea that is gaining in popularity. Public banks cut out the Wall Street middleman, bank fees are eliminated, interest rates drop, and the profits are reinvested into our community. Here to talk about this community-centered concept is Steve Swayzer. Steve serves on the steering committee of DC Public Banking Center. Welcome, Steve.
Thank you. Happy to be here and talk about this important topic tonight. I wanted to maybe we can just move to the next screen to talk about how public banking is growing around the country. You can see on here all the different places across the United States where there are public banking efforts underway. There are some very big things happening in a couple of places, including California, where there are efforts in several cities to establish public banks, as well as all the other places that you can see on the map. And I think the growing popularity of public banks around the country is really due to the fact that we've barely survived the crash, or really maybe many people have never recovered from the crash of 2008. And we're still suffering that, and now moving into another economic crisis caused by the coronavirus pandemic. So the public banking movement really could step up and play an important role, not only in helping people recover from the economic disaster that we're facing, the previous economic collapse that many people never recovered from, and also in terms of our growing threat of climate change, there's a very specific role that public banks could play for investing in environmentally sustainable projects. And I'll talk about those some more. But the four main goals of a public bank in DC, as set up by the DC Public Banking Center, are for investments in environmental sustainability, in affordable housing, in small local businesses, and to create local jobs. So those are our top priorities, and these are priorities that are largely underserved by the commercial banking world. If we look back to the financial crisis of 2008, that was really caused by Wall Street banks. The greed and corruption of those banks determined to squeeze every last drop of profit they could out of several different sectors, especially housing. And that trend continues to this day. And we need a different model of financial institutions that supports the public good and not the narrow financial interests of the private sector. And that's really what we have here in the United States. We have a banking sector that's predominantly privately run and done so in the interests of private investors. And if you look at other countries around the world, that's not the case either. I'm most familiar with the banking sector in Germany, where most of the banks, up to 2/3 of the banks, or the financial institutions, I should say, in Germany, are not private. They are public, or they are cooperative, or community owned, or some combination of the above. And I think that if we were looking at a model of a different way to organize our banking system, we would look to Germany for better examples. And a couple things that we'd like to see in DC are a public bank that's established and run by banking professionals and not politicians. So I don't want to get into weeds here of how, but something that DC government banking professionals with a governance structure that includes public input. And we see an opportunity to set up an advisory committee for the public to have regular input into the overall priorities of a public, and to provide input of the is serving the public interests and the interests of all DC residents, and not just targeted to the downtown area or the wealthier neighborhoods of DC. In terms of, I want to touch on a little bit on some of the lending programs that could be an opportunity for a public bank. And social housing is definitely a top priority for us that's under consideration. We are interested in exploring how a public bank could help finance social housing. And there are a few ideas floating around that we've discussed. We need to do a detailed feasibility study for the public bank. The city recently completed the start of a public bank feasibility study. It does not go far enough to allow the council to take steps, concrete actions to establish a public bank, but it's a foundation on which we could build for additional research and I think some greater expertise. We have some great banking expertise here in DC. We're the center of federal government, and we have some great organizations here, businesses, consulting firms, financial entities who have a wealth of knowledge of banking, and we'd like to bring their expertise to bear on public banking. And we've had conversations with them, and we know that they're eager to jump on the bandwagon of public banking. They can see the movement around the country that's taking place in the public banking sector. And we'd like to leverage their expertise to create a specific example of a public bank in DC. So that's high on our list of priorities for this fall and moving into 2021. A few questions that often come up around public banking are, let's see, a couple things are, who would run the bank? So we have thought about a system of governance that has a standard, I would say a standard board of directors like all other commercial banks have. And then a board of political appointees that appoints the members of the board of directors. And then the third tier is the advisory committee of the community that provides direct community input to the board. And just to step back in terms of how the bank works, we would eventually like to see the public bank become the bank of record for DC government. So it would take deposits from DC government, our tax deposits, the federal government payments, other revenues that flow into DC from all sorts of places, and they would eventually all be deposited in the public bank. And the public bank would leverage those deposits to make loans into various types of projects, like I mentioned before. So lending programs like social housing, or small business lending, or environmentally sustainable projects. I'd say the vast majority of the building stock in DC needs to be upgraded so that it moves closer to net zero. So it uses, it produces as much energy as it uses. So there's probably billions of dollars of potential investments that can be made into our existing real estate. And that needs to happen as soon as possible if we're going to stave off the climate crisis. There are a range of other smaller environmentally sustainable projects that could be financed through a public bank. There's an idea that's on the table to help the community development financial institutions who fund many of the small businesses in DC to help fund them through the public bank. So those are some of the specific ideas that are on the table. And the bank would earn interest on those loans. And for the near future, it would be a small bank to start out with. And for the near future, we would keep the profits of the public bank in the bank and help it grow up to the point where it could accept all the deposits and perform the basic banking functions for the District of Columbia government, for the government. Right now, the deposits are with about 20 different financial institutions. There's about $2 billion plus or minus on deposit with various financial institutions. Wells Fargo is the largest of those and does our property tax deposits. And we'd like to see those accounts gradually moved over to the public bank. And as it grows larger and more capable, more and more DC government banking accounts would be moved into the public bank. And that would further allow the public bank to increase the size of its loan programs and make further investments into the local DC economy. Because right now, those commercial banks are not using our deposits, our DC government deposits locally. Many of them are based in New York City, don't have any ties to DC whatsoever. And that money that we're sending to other places does not get invested in our local economy. The DC Public Bank would have the priority of investing all of its lending into the DC economy, and it would create local jobs and support the other lending priorities that I've discussed. I don't know where I am in time, but I could talk more, and I'd be happy to answer more questions about public banking that people have.
We're going to have to move on, but hopefully people will ask questions and we can come right back to you towards the end. Thank you so much, Steve, for that. That was very insightful. Our next topic is publicly owned utilities. Public power utilities are not-for-profit electric utilities that service over 2,000 communities in the United States, or 1 in 7 electric customers. They are owned by the community, so citizens have a direct voice in decisions, including rates and sources of electricity. They cost less, are more reliable, and give more back to the community than private utilities. Here to tell us more about it is John Schillen, founder of the DC Public Power, a nonprofit that advocates for public ownership of the Washington, DC electricity grid. Welcome, John.
Well, thank you for the introduction. Can everybody hear me? I hope it's clear. If not, somebody will let me know. It's really a great pleasure to be with you today. I know several of you there, and I hope to meet the rest of you in person someday. It's a nice eclectic group, the kind of cross-cutting issue analysis that I think is so lacking today, and I hope really bodes well for future political developments in DC, if not around the rest of the country. With future developments in mind, I want to try to talk about 3 things today. First, I'm going to give you a short bio of myself so you have some idea of my perspective. Maybe use that to either verify or undermine the things I say after. Then I'm going to talk about the experience of DC Public Power, what actually happened, what we learned, and then try to use that to segue what future activities might be. What other kinds of industrial utilities might we be thinking about that we want to try to accomplish? And then, of course, I'll take any Q&A immediately afterwards or at any point in our agenda today. All right, for me personally, I'm a small town boy from southwestern Pennsylvania, although I have family all up and down the East Coast and abroad. And so I have memories of me running around the streets of Manhattan when I was 10 years old and engaging in international travel as long as I can remember. I did my undergraduate work at Carnegie Mellon, which I think laid the foundation for my scientific outlook on life, as well as giving me some insight into engineering, which I claim to be an engineer. Afterwards, I went to Pitt Law School, tried to combine the technology love that I had with my activities in law, where I was writing equations for legal issues, but not ignoring the other aspects, constitutional law, which I love so much, and I actually did very well. The rest of my career really cannot be encapsulated too quickly. I'm 70 years of age. I've had 50 years of various kinds of experiences, and to a great extent, I epitomize the Washington, D.C. merry-go-round, where you're in government, you're in nonprofit, you do lobbying, you work for Beltway bandits, you go to work for commercial enterprises, rinse and repeat. And each one of those gives you a little more insight, a little more ability to get up on the ladder. I've enjoyed really great opportunities. I have had 2 projects announced by Al Gore, one big initiative on environment, another on housing advocacy. I have served as an international environmental diplomat. I've been involved in probably every programmatic area you can think of, from criminal justice, women's advocacy, child welfare protection, housing, energy, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And I won't go into too much more detail on that. But a couple of the interesting aspects of that really led me to DC Public Power. I am not averse to profit. I think the question is, how is profit distributed? And I've been an entrepreneur, heavily engaged in a lot of startups. One of the things that I think I should get credit for is trying to rely upon nonprofit mechanisms to support quasi-entrepreneurial activities. I learned a lot of this from the MacArthur Foundation, where they provided seed and startup money to nonprofits who they eventually hope will be self-sustaining. And I'm always ready to point out that nonprofits can make a profit. They just have to spend it on the right things. They cannot give it to to their management. It's got to be shared and distributed for nonprofit purposes. And nonprofits can accumulate wealth. There's no limit to what they can do and with retained earnings. So in many circumstances, if I've helped entrepreneurial, well, social entrepreneurs to set up nonprofit advocacy groups, I've helped people who are right on the line, who want to provide public services, try to find a way to mix and match the best of the nonprofit and the profit worlds. That's what drew me to DC Public Power. I've been involved in several DC activities for, I guess, the past maybe 10 or 15 years before that. I've been brought into DC government by a friend of mine who's actually one of the inventors of the internet to help the DC Office of Technology. I helped create the DC One card, the legal foundation for not only the data mining operations of DC, but the ability to identify and share data on various service recipients. How could somebody in the Department of Education find out the social welfare history of a child who's giving them challenges they do not understand? Through some of those connections, I was invited to a meeting the DC Public Power had, where I got to meet some of the other really social entrepreneurs who were trying to find a way to take advantage of a unique circumstance. We were faced with the onslaught of Exelon coming in and trying to buy Pepco assets all up and down the East Coast here in 3 major jurisdictions. We knew what Exelon represented. We knew how much they are similarly driven to other industrial activities, but in particular, the challenge we saw was how to stop Exelon from offloading these long-term costs of its nuclear generation capacity onto people like the residents of the District of Columbia. We knew for these people, DC was potentially a cash cow. It was a way for them to offload the cost of their services to a captive audience. Several of us who had been involved in various energy initiatives, other technology initiatives, knew we could get to the numbers. We knew what we could decipher about the actual operations of Pepco and what Exelon might be able to do. I was asked to be part of the initial board. I was not the incorporator. It had been established before me, but I came on eventually as general counsel. I took primary responsibility for all the legal filings, for much of the legal theory, and some of the strategy as well. And at a key point, when we knew just being able to provide data was inadequate, we decided we should make an offer for the assets of Pepco here in the district. It's a pretty interesting legal and business opportunity because Exelon, in order to make the entire acquisition move ahead, had to receive the authorization of 3 jurisdictions. Each jurisdiction had its own equivalent of a public service commission who had to bless the deal. And it looked like that was being gummed up. And the most interesting part was it might be most gummed up by the district. The district only represented a small portion of the assets that Exelon wanted to acquire, but it was all part and parcel of what Pepco had put together. So we tried to arrange essentially for a reverse spin-off acquisition that we would help Exelon consummate the deal by forcing them to spin off the DC assets. And we could then take the DC assets, create a nonprofit entrepreneurial entity to run the operations for the benefit of the district and for the benefit of the district citizens in particular. The district citizens will not technically be owners, but they would have representational capacity to guide the direction and operation of a nonprofit entity that would own the DC assets. We thought we had a chance. We actually had negotiated with various entities. We raised $1.5 billion, which enabled me to submit the offer to the DC Public Service Commission saying we want to buy the DC assets of Pepco. We thought a squeeze play was possible, to be frank, but it turned out the squeeze play was precluded. The hesitation went on, and in the end, Exelon knew they were going to get approval by the DC government before it had been handed down. We had learned, I've been told very specifically later on, this was a national matter. The Democratic interests in Chicago and in Illinois, where Exelon is headquartered, were so well wired into the Democratic Party that the DC government, DC officials had no alternative choice but to grace this acquisition by Exelon and let it move ahead. And of course, we were given a stiff arm. Not only were we not permitted to intervene, none of our filings were taken cognizance.
Okay, sorry guys. We have a question in the chat from Ann Wilcox, and that question is for Will, and it says, does social housing require a mix of incomes to be successful? How is that achieved?
Yeah, I think the key with social housing is that it does require a mix of incomes in order to be successful, because what social housing does is it creates the ability of housing to be self-sustainable. So really, to think of social housing, I think, is to think of well-operated cooperatives. It's just that social housing allows you to build that on a mass scale. So the way that it's done is that, you know, there is a, there could be, the way I envision it is there would have to be a minimum of people that are, you know, at risk of displacement, that are low income individuals, to be able to, you know, have access to every, you know, social housing building owned. And then, you know, the incomes would be mixed to make sure that operating costs are covered, just like people do in a cooperative. The other issue with social housing that, that could make this happen is, right now when we think about people who have vouchers, people who have subsidies, where those subsidies are going towards is to, you know, drive up the private market. So if somebody has a voucher and they're renting a place, you know, they're renting in a community that the market rents $3,100 a month for a 2-bedroom apartment, you know, the government is paying a lot of money to that developer to make up the difference between that person, you know, the renter's income and what that rent is. So we would use these federal subsidies in the social housing model to be invested back in the social housing building in order to help cover those operating costs, which would be a way to pair, you know, people, you know, low income people, working class people, having the ability to live in the social housing units and actually using their subsidies to pay off the construction loans for the building to build more affordable housing. Whereas now, again, we're using those subsidies to drive up the private market.
Okay, awesome. Thank you for that. And just to go back to John, we're running out of time, but we wanted to ask you a really quick question. Is there anything people can do to push publicly owned utilities forward in the district right now? I'm sorry, you seem.
Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you now.
All right. All right. So you asked the question. To me, the question is what to look forward to. There are two critical aspects here, and I think the first is to look at the political front we have. Democrat and Republican parties are aligned to block public utilities, and even more importantly is to think about information-oriented utilities. Less than 25 years ago, I was trying to work towards universal email. People have talked about universal access, internet access. I think the crucial aspect of utilities for us to consider are the information utilities that need to be established to create a level political playing field in the future. I'll leave it at that. I'm happy to answer any questions.
Thank you so much for that, John. And now I will be talking about the lack of transparency in DC government and the procurement policy that needs to be in place. But I wanted to start off with a quick fact and say that between 2005 and 2013, the median income for Native Washingtonians dropped from $26,000 to $22,000. While non saw their median income rise from $46,000 to $52,000. So that goes into saying about the influx of gentrification that's taking place in DC. And I had a client, I worked under a forum, and one of our clients were the Office of Planning, and we were working on this DC comprehension plan. And Will touched on it a lot, but a lot of it was regarding the dismantling of housing cooperatives, which already did exist and do exist under the first mayor, who was Marion Barry. And now mayors after that strategically have gotten rid of housing cooperatives to create displacement. And that is a huge issue. So it goes into talking about the corruption which exists in the DC government, and why is there corruption? How do we get citizens to become more involved, and native Washingtonian citizens to get more involved in these politics and advocating for themselves and having their voices heard? And that's one of the reasons why I joined the Green Party Independent Party, because it's separate from the Republican and Democratic Party, and also it gives us a way for us to articulate what our needs are and also to be inclusive in those needs. But to touch on a bit on lack of transparency and procurement policy, and there's a lot of abandoned homes in the DC area, just like Portland and Philadelphia and all over the nation. But in DC, it's a problem, because why do we have these open abandoned homes that are available, like for example by Howard, and there's no availability for there to be access or resources to the citizens? It's an issue, and it's something that it could easily be solved with anchor institutions aligning themselves with local businesses. So anchor institutions would be like universities. There's about 18 universities in the district, and these anchor institutions could easily allow for could easily allow for there to be an availability for procurement services or resources for local and Black businesses, but it hasn't been the case, and it's federally mandated. So when discussing about all these different issues, we have to tie together to ensure that everyone is having equitable resources and access to the government, as was mentioned before. But just to keep going along this, our public libraries are a community treasure, but how long will DC public libraries remain public? There is ongoing pressure to privatize them, and we've lost one already to a private developer. Our next speaker is Robin Daner, Director of the Library Renaissance Project and President of the Friends of the Martin Luther King Jr. Library. But before I get to Robin, there's a question in the chat. Let me ask it. Of current council members, are there any who have expressed support for social housing? How about Janice Lewis George coming into Ward 4? How would you go about rallying the public to demand social housing once you are, we hope, on the council? Anyone want to tackle that question on?
Was that a question for me?
Oh, for Will, sorry.
No, that's all right. Yeah, I mean, Janice Lewis George has expressed interest in the concept of social housing. The social housing, it's a new approach that, we've tried to popularize through this campaign. At the TENAC forum, there were a number of candidates that said, they were just learning about social housing, but they were, interested in further exploring the concept. So I think that the issue has been popularized through my campaign, and I'm glad that we've been able to do that. But as far as how to move it forward, if I were elected to council, I don't think that we would get social housing done in the back rooms of the Wilson building by horse trading. What I would do if I was elected is I would organize from the dais with the most impacted communities that I have been working with that are on the front lines of displacement, with labor unions to put together project labor agreements for this infrastructure project that would be social housing, and with people that need jobs and small businesses that are being priced out. So I think that we would build, and have been through this campaign, building those types of coalitions and creating political will from the outside to push through social housing and to make it a reality.
Thank you for that, Will. And now we're going to be moving forward with our next speaker, Robin Daner, Director of the Library Renaissance Project and President of the Friends of the Martin Luther King Jr. Library. Welcome, Robin.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, great. Thank you, Nakaja, and everyone. This is a wonderful group of people. I'm very happy to be invited to participate. So when Ralph Nader founded the Library Renaissance Project in 2002, we didn't realize we would be up against an unspoken or non-transparent plan to privatize our 26 public library properties. We thought we'd be pushing the city council to budget money for repairs, like a leaky roof at MLK Library or flooding at the Tenley and Anacostia Library basements, not to mention worn out books. I'm happy to say with 23 libraries entirely rebuilt so far, we only lost one to privatization. And that was the West End, a terrible, controversial, bitter battle. And back then we made a video of just how bad the deal was. So Deborah Akel made this film, and I think we're going to show it.
The East Bank swap is a bad deal for all of us. We give East Bank 3 parcels of public land, the West End Public Library, the Special Ops Police Station, and the West End Fire Station. Based on comparable value of surrounding property, these 3 parcels of public land are worth over $100 million. In exchange for the land, East Bank will rebuild the library and the fire station, which they say will cost them $20 million. $100 million in land for $20 million in construction? That's an $80 million giveaway. The library and the fire station will no longer be standalone buildings, and East Bank will own both the land and the buildings. That means East Bank will become our landlord. Do we want private developers owning our libraries and fire stations? What will happen to our critical public facilities in the future if East Bank decides to redevelop or sell? Under DC's inclusionary zoning law, East Bank must build a certain number of affordable units at their cost. But in this deal, we give East Bank an additional $7.2 million for the affordable housing, which East Bank will own and collect rent on. We also give East Bank a waiver to put the units over the fire station instead of the library. Under the original RFP, the winning bidder pays for building the interim space for the library and fire station, but East Bank gets an exemption, so we have to find and pay for the interim space, saving East Bank millions and putting those costs onto us. We give East Bank a waiver from paying their share of deed and recordation fees and transfer taxes, totaling $2.1 million. Library space will shrink by 2,000 square feet, and library parking spaces will shrink from 13 to 6. Oh, and we have to buy back those spaces from East Bank at about $50,000 each. Over the past 3 years, we've paid close to $300,000 for upgrades to the West End Fire Station, including high-tech airflow and water flow systems, custom windows and doors, a state-of-the-art alarm system, and more. How much of that $300,000 will go to waste in this deal? Councilman Jack Evans added a gimmick to benefit his district. 85% of deed and recordation fees from East Bank condo sales will go into a special interest fund for the West End instead of our citywide general fund as they should. This is the same councilman who, in 2007, pushed a similar East Bank sweetheart deal through City Council as emergency legislation. After the community protested, the deal was rescinded. This is another bad deal, full of waivers, giveaways, special interests, the loss of prime public property, critical public facilities with a questionable future, and $80 million of lost land value. Let's rescind this deal and redevelop the West End responsibly.
Thank you for that, Robin.
The East Bank swap is a
Thank you. What can people do to save McMillan Park and protect our libraries?
What can people do?
The East Bank swap is a bad
Frankly, it's people who pretty much saved all of the libraries.
The East
up till
Bank's
now. The Friends of the Library groups are located in every neighborhood, and you can join those. There's a central Friend of the Library group for the MLK Central Library, which, by the way, we saved in an incredibly long and bitter battle, which was recently completely renovated. It's a historic landmark. The West End deal was a public-private partnership, and we just need to avoid public-private partnerships. We were told by Jack Evans then that it was the only way that the library could be built, and this just is not true. It's never true. The city has spent $500 million plus public funds on transforming these libraries across the city, including MLK. We've won all kinds of awards and praise and appreciation from residents. So we don't need to sell our public assets to accomplish this work. I just want to sound one cautionary note. The original 4 libraries that were slated to be rebuilt included the Tenley Library, and amazingly, there too, there was a pretty big battle. It still remains in the crosshairs for privatization. The mayor is asking for housing to be put over the Tenley Library, and we really need to look at these development practices. The lack of transparency in our system is just astounding. And that applies to the McMillan Park situation in Ward 5, which is just a few minutes walk from my house in Ward 2. So I consider it my own. I got involved with it because there was meant to be a library at McMillan, but in the current plans, there is not. We need to rethink this McMillan development, which is just a cookie cutter, town center, completely unimaginative thing. And as you can see from the photos, there's these beautiful, I forget what these are called, sand towers, I believe. They're covered in ivy currently, but they could have lots of interesting things done with them. And the caverns underneath, and you see the picture of the caverns, are just extraordinary. And they're some of the only ones left in the world. This sand filtration plant filtered water, and it helped solve the terrible plague, if you will, of cholera that so many cities at that time had to deal with. There's a lot that we can do creatively. This is a preserved, a protected landmark. We need something beautiful and creative, like there's a picture here of what's called Bosco Verticale in Milan, which is an all green structure that has plants and trees all over it. And if we're going to build anything on this beautiful old park, this would be the kind of thing. Public, of course, public housing, everything must remain public. And that would be the kind of thing that we would be looking for if we were to re-envision McMillan, as we hope that the mayor will eventually decide to do, because this case remains in court. The impact studies that were required have never been done, and the financial wherewithal that was required to be demonstrated has never been demonstrated. So there will be more news on this as that case is heard in court to its conclusion. And people can join Save McMillan Park. There's all kinds of resources available if you want to follow. There's newsletters that are sent and lots of opportunities to participate. Same with the library. So thanks for letting me speak.
Thank you. Now I want to introduce David Schwartzman. David joined the DC Statehood Party in 1976, soon after he moved to DC. He's a retired Howard University professor continuing research on climate change, solar energy, and eco-socialism. He's the chair of the Political Policy and Action Committee of the DC Statehood Green Party, and his main focus has been on getting progressive taxes in DC, taxing the rich, to eliminate DC's big racial and economic disparities. Welcome, David.
Yeah, thank you. It's a real pleasure, and what a distinguished panel. And Natasha, it's great for you to be doing this, our new member. So I'm going to start really by giving a very brief history of the DC Statehood Green Party. We were actually founded in 1971 by Julius Hobson running for office. That got us ballot status, 1971. Julius Hobson was a leader of the fight against Jim Crow in DC, a fighter for jobs and education for Black folk. And he started it, and that founded really the movement for statehood in DC. And then there were other leaders then as well that should be mentioned. Hilda Mason, who was on the council for quite a while, and Joe Butler, another leader, and Sam Smith, who's now living in Maine, the editor of Progressive Review. So in 1999, the little DC Green Party, which was founded in 1996, with the first run of Ralph Nader for president, merged with the DC Stated Party, and we became the DC Stated Green Party, and we've maintained ballot status ever since. And typically we have the second most votes compared to the Democratic Party in DC for our candidates. So that's a very brief introduction. Our website is statehoodgreenofdc.org, newly launched website, and you can find our candidates' websites there too. So please go to the next slide. Yes, now what I'm going to talk about now in my remaining time, and I'll try to keep really close to the 5 minutes, is this challenge that we're facing in DC in terms of the budget shortfall, and again, the threat, once again, like during the control board era over 20 years ago, that the DC Council and Mayor will balance the budget on the backs of our working class and low income residents. That's the threat we're facing. And what's compounding it is the deep crisis that our residents are facing. So many of our residents are facing, working class Black and brown residents in particular, who are dying at disproportionate rates from the COVID-19. And the total now is almost 650 deaths. And disproportionately Black and brown folk are dying from this, mainly because they constitute the essential workforce. They're living in more congested housing conditions. And this is unacceptable. And this is also true nationally, by the way. And I have a PowerPoint, which of course I don't have time to go through, but I would be happy to share it with anyone watching this. Just email me at dschwartzman@gmail.com. What we're seeing here right now is the reality of institutional racism in DC. And I rather call it by its name, white supremacy in the service of the big developers, the bankers, and the corporate sector. That's what it is. And we've had the policies of trickle-down austerity budgets in the last 20 years, and this has actually generated the big racial and economic disparities that we witness in DC, the income and wealth inequality, the gap in life expectancy between Black and white residents, and high child poverty and homelessness. So what can we do about it now? Well, this graph, this slide, shows who is getting the most of the tax cuts from the Trump legislation. So it's the richest that are getting it. And so they're getting this huge tax cut. It's actually amounts to this year, those who are making over $350,000 are getting over $400 million tax cut from the Trump legislation. This is the federal legislation. So what can the council do? We can capture this tax cut by raising these residents' DC income tax rate, just like New Jersey just passed a millionaire's tax, and other states are considering a similar approach. So we need to demand that the tax base that exists in DC serves the people of DC and not is just pocketed by the very rich. And by the way, if we raise the DC income tax rate of these wealthy residents a few percent, they will actually pay the same overall federal and DC taxes that they did before the Trump legislation. So this is hanging fruit that we need to put a really big pressure on the DC Council to pass a decent income tax hike for the richest to fund the needs of our working class residents who are suffering now in this deep crisis. For further information, I will certainly send you the PowerPoint to anyone requests, and I'll put my email in the chat line so everybody could see it. Hope there are some questions out there, but thanks. I think I try to keep to my time. Thank you very much.
All right, now I'll introduce our final speaker. Peter Bolton is the DC State HUD Green Party candidate for Ward 2 Council. He is running to offer a real choice to Ward 2 voters, a platform of many, if not all, of the issues that were represented on tonight's call that can create people-centered transformational change. Take it away, Peter.
Thank you, Natasha, for that very kind introduction and for your very impressive hosting of the event today. Thank you to the other speakers. I've learned a great deal in this short hour and have greatly expanded my knowledge. I entered this race in Ward 2 mainly because I feel very strongly that the Democratic Party has completely failed this city. BC has the highest homelessness rate per capita, I believe, in the entire United States. Gentrification has displaced huge amounts of people to neighboring jurisdictions. The cost of housing has gotten so out of control that people are so rent burdened that many are paying 50% or even more of their income just to pay the rent. And this has all been presided over by an almost exclusively Democratic Party political class. The mayor has been a Democrat for decades. The council has been composed almost exclusively of Democrats for decades. And the reason why they've presided over the situation is because they've cozied up to developers, to private interests, to corporations as part of a sordid quid pro quo in which they serve the interests of those developers and corporations and not the interests of ordinary working and middle class district residents. I entered this race in part also because I was disgusted by the actions of Jack Evans, who of course was a Democrat and who personifies what I just described. He resigned in disgrace following multiple ethics scandals in which he was in cahoots with developers. And then he was replaced by a young woman named Brooke Pinto, who won the Democratic primary with less than 30% of the vote, and then a special election in which her Democratic Party rivals suspend their campaigns. She's already been facing allegations that make it seem as if her tenure is practically just a continuation of that of Jack Evans. Now, as for my policies, I want to make clear that the Democratic Party's line is that our party's proposals are somehow unrealistic. They say that they'll cost too much, that they're unworkable, that there are legacy issues that have to be taken into consideration. I argue forthrightly that not only are my policies realistic, they've also been tried and successfully implemented in many other parts of the world, particularly in Europe, but also in Canada, New Zealand, Australia, even in the United States, in some cases, as we heard from the other speakers. The problem is that neoliberalism has come to dominate US politics and has bipartisan support. I'm going to give a very quick definition of neoliberalism from Corp Watch. The main points of neoliberalism include the rule of the market, cutting public expenditure for social services, deregulation, privatization, and crucially the fifth, eliminating the concept of the public good or community and replacing it with, quote, individual responsibility, and pressuring the poorest people in a society to find solutions to their lack of healthcare, education, and social security all by themselves, and then blaming that on them if they fail and calling them lazy. And just a very quick other definition is this concept of accumulation by dispossession, which is a concept that was developed by the Marxist British geographer David Harvey. It defines neoliberal capitalist policies that result in a centralization of wealth and power in the hands of a few by dispossessing the public and private entities of their wealth or land. Such policies are visible in many Western nations from the 1970s into the present day. Harvey argues these policies are guided mainly by four practices: privatization, financialization, management, and manipulation of crises, and state redistributions. So, having gotten through the academic stuff, what are my policies? So first of all, my platform contains a provision for public banking. I would like to see the District of Columbia have both a public investment bank and a public commercial bank. In terms of both would mean that you'd have banks where there aren't profiteers, no shareholders. They would also both set standards for the wider industry and improve standards in the private sector as well. One of the other speakers, I believe it was Steve, mentioned Germany, which is a great example. They have a system of banks that are called the Sparkassen. I will also support the idea of having public banking services for low and middle income people with service available at post offices. Improves access, has worked very well. An example of that is the Gyro Bank in the UK. This was set up by a very brilliant man, a Labour politician and MP called Tony Benn, who sadly died a few years ago. And he made a very good case about how right-wingers destroy public enterprise even when it's succeeding because they oppose it on ideological grounds. Margaret Thatcher in the 1980s ended up selling the Gyro Bank to a private bank called Alliance and Leicester. And it was for exactly that reason. She wanted to destroy it. But that's a model that was working well and that we could follow here in DC. Second of all, I'm a strong, ardent supporter of public municipal ownership of utilities. This would mean no profiteering, no parasitism, no more Pepco and Exelon. We would send these usurers, these parasites, these profiteers back on the train to Chicago. Service could then be delivered at cost because you're taking out the overhead of paying dividends to shareholders. You're taking out the overhead of paying salaries, which are very often obscene, to the CEOs of these companies. And why I feel so strongly about this is because the current system, you have middle and working class families paying these exorbitant rates, and that money then goes to line the pockets of wealthy shareholders and wealthy CEOs. Again, this is not some radical proposal that's never been tried ever in human history. It is in fact very common throughout Europe. The Netherlands is an example where they have all of their utilities and their transport system publicly owned. Works very well. The Netherlands often ranks near or at the top in studies ranking social well-being and the sort. Even in the UK, which is sort of like the US of Europe, it's like the neoliberal outlier. Scotland and Northern Ireland, which in the 90s were given a degree of regional autonomy, have set up public utilities for some of their services. I believe water in the case of both Scotland and Northern Ireland. Okay. Very quickly, the last two. My platform includes a pledge to abolish public-private partnerships in the entire WMATA system. Another speaker brought this up, I think it was Robin, about how these have been disastrous. Again, leads to profiteering, lining the pockets of shareholders, other wealthy interests. And of course, that comes out of the pocket of the people who are passengers and who are actually using the system, many, if not most of whom, are ordinary working and middle-class folks. Finally, As extreme as it might seem, I believe that we should abolish all user fees on the entire WMATA system. That would be a way of saving money, commuter costs, again, for working and middle class folks. It's been done as a temporary measure, I understand, during the pandemic. I see no reason why it can't be made permanent. Other places, again, in Europe have tried this very successfully. I see no reason why DC couldn't do likewise. I'll bring it to an end there, but I welcome your questions. Thank you, everybody who's joined the call. And I look forward to continuing this in the Q&A. Thanks.
If anyone has any questions, feel free to ask them, but that's it for tonight's call. Thank you for all our speakers, and thank you all for joining. If you'd like to learn more about the DC Statehood Green Party or to become a member or donate, please visit our site at statehoodgreensofdc.org. I'll re-put it in the chat, and also don't forget to vote. Have a great night. Let's see. No question.
Thank you for everyone's contribution. Natasha, this was a terrific oration. Thank you.
I take it we ran out of time for Q&A.
Lots of great ideas. Thank you very much.